Unified School District, where special education students' needs are underfunded to the tune of nearly $1 billion every year. UTLA members have been fighting the school to prison pipeline for years, and we've won significant victories. That fight continues on multiple fronts. One of the most important fronts is the disparate discipline and criminalization of students with disabilities, especially students of color. Or students of color with disabilities. Our schools are not carceral institutions. They are the greatest resource for our communities. Our students are entitled to services, not interactions with law enforcement. Next slide, please. The policing of disabled persons in the United States. Disabled people are 44% more likely to be arrested by the age of 28. Greater than 1 in 2, that's 50%, more than 50% of Black Americans with a disability will be arrested by the age of 28. 50% of persons killed by law enforcement annually are disabled. This is the result of chronic underinvestment in resources and overinvestment in police. I live in one of those communities that must fight every day for basic resources, but have an overinvestment of policing. It is important to note, the US government does not collect statistics on police violence, including death at the hands of law enforcement. This has been left up to journalists to keep track. And the best of these is the Fatal Force database run by the Washington Post. Next slide, please. At 737 people per 100,000 and a cost of 81 billion, that's billion with a B, annually, the United States incarcerates a greater share of its population than anywhere else in the world. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, a third of all prisoners in the United States have a hearing, vision, cognitive, or ambulatory disability. 40% of persons awaiting trial or sentencing, those considered in jail, live with a disability. If we look at gender, 50% of women awaiting trial live with a disability. Next slide, please. We've just seen the statistics on what it is like for many adults with disabilities in this country. Catherine Lehman has been nominated to again head the Office of Civil Rights under the Biden administration and will likely be confirmed by the Senate in the next couple of weeks. It is clear from her work that she recognizes the connection between disparate discipline in schools and the school to prison pipeline. The Office of Civil Rights was created, and I quote, to ensure equal access to education and to promote educational excellence throughout the nation through vigorous enforcement of civil rights. So, why is it that so many persons with disabilities have so much contact with law enforcement? We would argue it is a question of resource priorities and civil rights enforcement. And I will turn it over to Anthony.
Thank you, Georgia, and good morning, everyone. So what do the numbers tell us about discipline and students with disabilities in our schools throughout the nation? If we look at days of lost instruction, i.e. days students are actually out of school due to discipline, we find large, disparate impacts to students with disabilities. The UCLA Civil Rights Project calculated the number of calculated the number of days students with disabilities lost nationwide compared to students without disabilities. If we looked at any random group of 100 secondary students with disabilities, that group would collectively have lost 65 days of instruction due to out-of-school suspensions over the 2018 school year. That is compared to 31 days of lost instruction for any random group of 100 secondary students without an IEP. So if you have an IEP, you will likely lose double the number of days of a student without an IEP nationwide. As you can see, if you go further down the chart here, that pattern holds for elementary students, where students with disabilities could expect to lose nearly 3 times as many days due to out-of-school suspensions. Next slide, please. Now, we just saw how egregious the split is for all students with disability. But now we're going to drill down on this by race and ethnicity. Using the same metrics explained in the previous chart, if we looked at any random group of 100 Black students with disabilities in K-12 education in this country, public schools, between them, the group will have lost 142 days due to suspension. You can see that is well above absolutely everyone else on this chart. And we already said that just looking at the group in the aggregate, the split was huge between students with disabilities and students without disabilities. Next slide, please. So we just looked at out-of-school suspensions and the consequences thereof to our students with disabilities and students with disabilities of color. So we're going to take a look at the rates of referrals to law enforcement for students with disabilities at the 5 largest districts where the greatest Black-white disparity exists in discipline. A quick look at non-disabled students first, so those without an IEP, if we look to the left here of this graph. As you can see, in Austin Independent School District in the state of Texas, nearly 1 in 10 non-disabled Black students is referred to law enforcement, compared to 1 in 50 white students without a disability. The difference is clearly already significant, looking at students without IEPs. Now, when we look at Black students with disabilities, so those with IEPs, we see that 32% were referred to law enforcement in 2018. That's 1 out of every 3 Black students with a disability. This compared to nearly 11% of white students with a disability, or 1 of every 10 white students. So we see the pattern already. We see the pattern wherein there is a difference between students with and without disabilities, and it's huge already. And then we drill down on students with disabilities, and when we look at race, it's ridiculous, is what it is. And we're going to see what this looks like in our schools and outside of our schools next. I really want to hit upon this because we'll come back to it later. 1 of every 3 Black students with an IEP in Austin is interacting with law enforcement instead of receiving their federally entitled services. Next slide, please. And Lisa, you're up.
We've just heard about the data, but what does that look like when we put names and faces to those numbers? As a special education teacher for 17 years, one of the goals for my students is to learn how to advocate for themselves, to learn how to have productive and fulfilled lives in their communities. Sadly, many will continue to face obstacles and injustices. Here are just a few of those stories. Adam Trammell, 22 years old, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Adam Trammell was a young schizophrenic man. He had an episode and walked out of his apartment without clothing. A neighbor was alarmed and called the police. Before the police arrived, he got himself to the shower. His parents explained that's how Adam calmed himself down during an episode. The police came into his home and tased him to death in his own shower. I know students like Adam. I've taught students like Adam. I cannot tell you the immense accomplishment it is to help a young person to become self-sufficient, to responsibly manage an episode. Adam Trammell. Next slide. Elijah McClain, 23, Aurora, Colorado. Elijah McClain went down to the corner store to buy his little brother an iced tea. He was walking home when someone called the cops on him for looking sketchy. As he called out, "I'm an introvert. I'm just different. That's all. I'm so sorry. I have no gun. I don't do that stuff. I don't do any fighting. Why are you attacking me? Forgive me. All I was trying to do was become better. I will do it. I will do anything." He was put into a carotid hold and injected with a large dose of ketamine by the cops. He was unarmed. They killed him. His death was ruled inconclusive because he lived in the hospital for another 3 days. He will never show up in our statistics. Elijah McClain. Next slide, please. 11 to 14-year-old students with disabilities. Jabari Boykin, Syracuse, New York, 14 years old, bipolar ED, emotionally disturbed, was suspended for refusing to go to class. He left to get on the city bus to go home. Having missed that bus, he returned to school. The school resource officer arrested him for trespassing and broke his arm. A 14-year-old young woman in New Mexico with an intellectual disability was forced to the ground after having taken more milks than she was permitted. 11-year-old Abraham Hibbert is a child in Lancaster, California. He is autistic. He was cuffed and thrown in the back of a police vehicle when he ran from school. Next slide, please. In 2019, Riverside, California. An 11-year-old Black student with disabilities was thrown to the floor, and then the weight of full-grown police officers put on their knees in his back and handcuffed a 70-pound child for refusing to go to the principal's office. 8-year-old Jemiah Rickman, 6-year-old Kaya Rowley, 10-year-old Tristan Boyer, and an unidentified 8-year-old with autism are handcuffed in Florida. All with IEPs, all put in handcuffs and arrested. Next slide, please. Over 1,400 school districts employ more police than nurses, psychologists, social workers, and counselors combined. Milwaukee had 135 more school police than nurses, psychologists, social workers, and counselors combined. Chicago public schools have more than 2,000 more school police officers than nurses, psychologists, social workers, and counselors combined. These are some of the largest school districts in the nation. Chicago is the third, Broward County is the sixth, and Montgomery, Maryland is the 14th. Please remember the images that you have seen in the previous slides. These are the students we work with. Next slide, and to Grace.
What we're seeing right now is a percentage of IEPs for each student ethnic group in LAUSD. The total percentage of students with disabilities is 13.2%. 17% of Native American students have an IEP. Just over 16% of Black, white, and multiracial students have an IEP. 13% of Latinx students have an IEP. And from there, the percentage of identification then drops precipitously to 6.7% of Asian students and 6% of Hawaiian and Pacific Islander students with an IEP. Next slide, please. The Office of Civil Rights maintains statistics across the United States on students with disabilities. Every 2 years, this data is collected by the U.S. Department of Education. In LAUSD, a district with over 500,000 students, there were only 222 students with 504 accommodations. That's only 0.04% of LAUSD students. Compare this to the national percentage of 504 students at 2.7%. 13.2% of LAUSD students have an IEP. Compare this to the national percentage of 14.1%. But when it comes to discipline, LAUSD students with an IEP make up more than 27% of suspensions, 30% of the days lost due to suspensions, 20% of referrals to school police, and 22% of all arrests by school police. Next slide, please. Over the last 10 years, the failure of Congress to meet its original promise to fund IDEA at 40% has deprived LAUSD special education students and educators of over $2.1 billion in resources. I want you all to take a second to think about what you, as an educator, what your school, what your classrooms, what it would look like if over the last 10 years, you and your students had received over $2.1 billion in resources. The fact is, when we were forced to fight for scarce and adequate resources for our most vulnerable students, there are only a couple of ways to manage the unmet need, and they often work in concert with one another. First, limit access to district and school special education resources by limiting eligibility in a high-cost special education program. And second, as we have seen today, define manifestations of a disability as dangerous and an issue to be managed by law enforcement. A police officer is cheaper than ensuring students have access to nurses, psychologists, social workers, therapists, and meaningful accommodations. We've recreated the carceral system that is part of many of our students' lives outside of school. In fact, we've recreated it to the point that elementary students are being handcuffed and arrested and brutalized. As a former autism therapist myself, seeing pictures of littles being treated in this way is especially heartbreaking. We must invest in and prioritize systems that meet our students' needs. We are fighting together for a different vision, a vision where every school has the resources it needs for our students to thrive. So, how do we change this system? We need two things. We need adequate and equitable funding, and we need strong and proactive enforcement to protect our students' civil rights. Next slide, please. It is our first priority to protect our children. Our students need our support and our safety. IDEA funding is imperative to create safe, welcoming spaces in which our children can blossom. Covering the promise gap will result in more nurses, counselors, social workers, school psychologists. It will increase inclusion programs and will ensure our children thrive in a space that they have not been conditioned to fear or have been repeatedly told to leave through suspensions. But this is not enough. The U.S. Department of Education has to proactively assess and act on the data it requires schools to provide. There is no point in collecting this data if you're not going to proactively use it to protect students. Just some examples. No action has been brought forth by the OCR to address Austin's rate of 1 in 3 Black students with a disability being referred to law enforcement. Further, no action has been brought forth regarding LAUSD's egregious lack of Section 504 identifications among our students. So I'm going to hand it back to Debbie.
Next slide, please. So what can we do? A diverse, multi-state, multi-city group of parents, teachers, unions, and civil rights leaders are leading the change and charge to secure the original promise of 40% IDEA funding and demand the US federal government take seriously its duty to ensure the civil rights of students with disabilities. Actions and victories. The group commissioned an in-depth and widely reported analysis of civil rights violations authorized by the UCLA Civil Rights Project. We filed a class petition for guidance with the US Department of Education to address the current and longstanding enforcement of civil rights protections throughout the United States. As a result, the coalition has had several meetings with the US Department of Education, including a sit down with Education Secretary Cardona. These meetings are ongoing and more are being scheduled. Every day we are growing the coalition and building greater power with advocates across the country, including local civil rights advocates and the Children's Rights Division of the American Bar Association. Please follow at Promise with Phil on Twitter. I'm now going to turn it over to our amazing UTLA Elementary Vice President, Gloria Martinez, who is also a special educator. Gloria?
Thank you, Debbie, for those kind words. And thank you for being such an incredible leader in this fight. And thank you, Lisa and Georgia, Avi and Grace, for this powerful presentation. My phone has not stopped ringing, although it's on silent now, asking for this powerful information because we know that this message needs to get out to as many people as possible, which is why we're so excited to present it here to you today. Joining me this morning are members from the Fulfill the Promise Coalition. From Madison, Wisconsin, we have from the Madtown Mamas Advocacy Group are Anna Hauser and Martha Saravo. We're also joined by Reclaim Our Schools LA parent Tiffany Gardner, and from Education Austin, special education teacher Alyssa Potasnik. Thank you all for joining me. So we're going to have a conversation. I have some questions I wanted to ask you in regards to our coalition. And we just saw those powerful slides, so feel free to share any emotions or concerns that you want to share with us today. So Anna, I'm going to start with you. You are a staunch advocate, and just getting to know you over the last few months has been such a joy, and I'm learning so much from the Madtown Mamas. Please tell us about your experience and your child's experience during remote learning.
Sure. Hi, my name is Anna Hauser. I am a mom to 3 kiddos, all of who have some sort of disability. I'm also a member of the Madtown Mamas and the secretary, and we are working really hard to get things done. But so my experience during this situation really stems on 2 of my children. My oldest, Xavier, he's 16 and he has, he's nonverbal and he has cerebral palsy. And during the pandemic, one of the things we really ran into was that the individualized part of our IEP really just stopped. It became a group focus, and it was, you know, what can serve everybody's needs the most, but it didn't serve his needs at all. And you can't meet his needs virtually. He has physical therapy and he has occupational therapy, he has assistive technology, and none of the classroom supplies, they're not like, we're watching a video right now. If you are a person who is not sighted, you're not having audio description of what people are doing, what their faces look like, and he can't see any of his supplies. And so he really struggled. Like, he just didn't have an education. And by the end of it, the last month, he was just sleeping through class. He was massively depressed. And I also have another child, and she's 9 years old. She's got an autoimmune disorder, and she's behind in her learning because she's missed so much school throughout the years. And when we got to the beginning of the pandemic, what happened for her is that they told us we didn't need a 504 plan. They're like, oh, we're in a pandemic, no need, not a big deal. And I should have done something about it then, but I was like, yeah, you know, we'll be at home, it's no big deal. I didn't even think about it. And they referred us to a reading interventionist who emailed me once, and I tried to contact her, and we spent the entire year and we never heard back from her once. Like, I repeatedly tried to get a hold of this woman. And so my child continued to go down the road of not having reading intervention for an entire year. And we also had our teacher who just didn't support it. I was like, you know, my child has anxiety. They need to have their camera off. The gym teacher kicked her out of class because she wasn't able to have her camera on. And the teacher just said, you know, I can't tell somebody else how to teach. And so eventually we ended up pulling my youngest child from the district because they were just so anxious and it was so miserable that we just couldn't do that. Now, we live in a state where I live in Wisconsin, and our state has the lowest statistics for people who use 504 plans. It's 0.7% of our population. We also have some of the lowest funding at our state level for reimbursement as well. So when we are shorted on the federal side as well as our state side, our state really, really suffers. And the other thing that doesn't exist is there's no protection for students with 504 plans. Like, students with IEPs have the IDA funding. You know, we have all of that stuff going on. Students with 504s don't have that, and we need to have that in place, because without it, you end up with students who are being left behind, like my student. And we're about to head back from a pandemic where more and more and more students are needing to have their need, you know, they're going to be needing 504 services, and we didn't magically get more staff, we didn't magically get more funding, and there's going to be more need. And so here we are, and what's going to happen to all of these students who have this need without all of this funding? Like, money doesn't solve everything, but obviously it's needed to run things. You have to have the base needs met, and they're not being met. They're absolutely being failed.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
Thank you, Anna. I appreciate that. Some of the things that you said really stood out. One, it's not just about funding, but it's also about enforcement, which is something that this coalition really looked at, right? It wasn't just about bringing attention to the underfunding, which is absolutely critical, but it's also the need for enforcement. I remember waiting for DeVos to give us some guidance once when this pandemic first started and we went into remote learning. Until this day, I'm still waiting for that type of guidance. And we hope through our petition, legal petition that we filed, we hoped that the Office of Civil Rights reinstates the 2014 Obama guidance that was so crucial. So thank you for sharing so much on that. I'm going to go now to your comrade, Martha, from the other amazing mama from Madtown Mamas. So Martha, I wanted to ask you, what do you see as necessary to make our students with disabilities whole as we return to in-person instruction during this phase of the pandemic?
Hi, thank you, Gloria. I'm so glad to be here amongst all these awesome advocates and to relive the positivity we can gain from each other. My name is Martha. I'm the president of Mantown Mamas and Disability Advocates. I'm also Miss Wheelchair Wisconsin 2020 and 2021. And my focus on when it comes to our students who are coming back into the classroom is last year was traumatic for everybody, especially for students. We pulled everybody out of school. But what did we do? Madison and a lot of other places across the country, we approached it as removing SROs from schools. Let's remove the officers. So what did we replace them with though? We replaced them with some restorative justice. So what is restorative justice in special education? Does it exist? Do we know what it means? What are we going to create in that space now? So that means that we're not only going to be coming back to trauma-related needs. What is that? That is so different for every single student. That's going to be a discussion that goes to a mental health side, that goes to anxiety, just being in a new building, being around our peers again. There are so many different factors that are going to come to the table that are going to be unexpected and possibly really, really new feelings for so many more students. And when we look to guidance should cross the board cover several different areas. It should cover what we are physically doing in the classrooms, what we are holding ourselves accountable for, and maybe we're offering some professional development amongst our teachers and other staff members, because how do we get to that new place that allows us to appreciate each other for all the unique needs that our students have without making sure that our educators are able to have these discussions with our students. So there's a lot of work that really needs to be done around the professional development side of things and around the communication styles. When I'm part of a restorative justice committee here in Madison, after we pulled that to really hone in on the special education needs for our students. But special education crosses over the racial disparities that we're already recognizing in our own districts. So we can't even truly have a discussion that says these are the issues without saying this is affecting everybody. Madison had, in the report that we had right after the pandemic, 51 of our SROs who students came in contact with there were 51 altogether. 41 were Black students. 51, I totally apologize. 84 students altogether. 51 were Black students. 41 were special education students. That is atrocious. That's over half. And those data sets should never be something that we should be expected to come back to, nor want to. Our responses versus our reactions, that's where we need to come into. A reaction means that we're dealing with something in the moment way too fast. A response means that we've taken some time to think about what has happened, to maybe appreciate what this person is going through, and to actually attend to their needs and support them in the most meaningful way possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. Really quickly, tell us about that sash you are wearing so proudly.
So this is for Miss Wheelchair Wisconsin. There's a Miss Wheelchair for all the states actually out there that are focused on different parts of a passion that they have. And the one that I have been focused on is inclusive education. And this little girl here who's 9 years old is the reason that I'm in on it, because inclusion means that we are not just bringing our students together. It means that we are appreciating them for everything that they are, and we are supporting them in the best way that we know how.
Thank you, Martha. And I love what you said about, the intersectionality of our struggles. I think as educators and parents and community and advocate groups, we're learning about the intersectionality, how a lot of what we are fighting for on so many deep levels just work in conjunction of each other, right? And there's a fight in all of us. And I also just want to acknowledge what you said about response. I think, as we know, so many of our students have been faced with such trauma during these last 18 months, and how we as educators, we as parents respond to the way it manifests in the classroom or at home will be critical as part of our healthy and healing and just a return for our students. So thank you very much. So I'm going to go now to Tiffany, who I met. Let me tell you, before I introduce Tiffany Gardner from Reclaim Our Schools LA, I have to tell you how Tiffany and I met. We were in a bargaining session at Beaudry, right, Tiffany? And our bargaining team was there, and the way it works is the bargaining, our team goes in there and we would huddle in the morning, very early in the morning. And then we would text the district team, and we would, like, okay, let's meet. And one day we were, getting our thoughts and our strategy together, and in walks Tiffany with her amazing son. And I thought Tiffany was there to kind of like scope us out and spy on us. And instead what she said was like, isn't this like where I come and support the teachers? From then on out, I was like, yes, but not right now, because we're in a private bargaining session. Let me get your number. And then through our amazing parent and community organizing team, Esperanza and Ilse, and Reclaim Our Schools LA, Tiffany has been a warrior, and the zest that she brings for advocating for her children is the same type of zest that she brings when she speaks on behalf of all of those that cannot be there to speak for themselves. So Tiffany, welcome. As a mother in Los Angeles, what do you want the educators of United Teachers Los Angeles to know, not only about your child, but just about students with disabilities in general?
Good morning, Gloria. Thank you so much for having me. I think as a parent advocate and a supporter of UTLA and chapter chairs, I've seen firsthand the difficulties, especially here in Los Angeles when it comes to hitting a funding wall. I've seen teachers having to use their personal funds to supply their students with materials and supply their classrooms with supplies. And this isn't just common in Los Angeles. This is the norm in public education. As a parent of a student with an IEP, I myself, more often than not, am frustrated with the consistent lack of support from the district officials when the issue of equitable resources and staffing for my son's most basic and health and educational needs are the topic. There has been instances where my nonverbal son with a tracheostomy tube, who has been identified as deaf with a identification for speech and language, DHH services, and ASL translation, has missed an entire year of services. And that's completely wrong. My son and students like my son are capable and willing to learn, and they want to. And they deserve an equitable and equal education as their peers do. They have proven, like my son, time and again, that when given the proper resources and support, that they can thrive. But students like Isaiah have been disproportionately disenfranchised and left behind by the public education system. But this is a systemic issue in the United States and in public education. We have a long history of discrimination that has been addressed in every generational movement and has been intertwined in education, from women's rights and the right to vote and the ability to work and the ability to attend school, as in civil rights of African Americans with the ability to vote and be treated as citizens and to have integration. And now here we are again, and this movement, this special education movement, is a movement of civil rights. This is a fight for students, for fair education and equal treatment. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany. I, again, just applaud everything that you three mamas are doing. And I know when you speak at these meetings that we have managed to to arrange and when you speak to others, you always come from the lens of representing other parents and guardians who are not present, right? Who we have 3 women here who understand the English language, who are educated, who are natural advocates, and are still hitting walls and still having to go, over hurdles to get the needs of your children met. And one of the things you talked about, Tiffany, was the resources and underfunding. In our PowerPoint, and sorry, Madtown Mamas, we're going to focus a little bit on LAUSD a bit. In our PowerPoint, we talked about the $1 billion like yearly loss because of the underfunding of IDEA. So when we say fulfill the promise, we're not asking IDEA to be funded at 100%. We're asking that it be funded at the promise it was made at its inception, which is 40%. And in LAUSD, roughly, imagine what an extra $100,000 would look like, right, at your school sites. Like, imagine what that could provide for resources, what we can do to amp up our services, to attract and retain the service providers that we need to service the children of Anna and Tiffany and Martha, right? And, so this fight encompasses us all, right? I was very fortunate to be, prior to this plenary, to be in the Valley West meeting, and in a small group, one of the members, you know who you are, said, special education is general ed education. And we need to bring that down. And I think Debbie did that beautifully when she was framing up and opening up this plenary. So now I'm going to turn over to Alyssa. Alyssa is an educator in Austin. You remember from our PowerPoint, the egregious stats that we saw coming out of Austin. But I also hear, Alyssa, Texas is often referred to as ground zero for the special education fight and the fight to serve our students. So when you and I first met and you told your story, I lost a lot of sleep that night because I could see the writing on the wall on this. And so I wanted to I'm not even gonna pose a question. I'm just gonna ask you to please just tell us about the landscape in Austin around special education and your experience, please.
Yeah, thank you. So I've been a special education teacher in Texas and California for the past 11 years. I don't have the time to get into the myriad issues with special education in Texas. It's a long list. But suffice to say, what we're seeing now is the end game of years and years of Texas intentionally and systematically excluding students with disabilities, particularly low-income children and children of color, from getting the support and services that they need. This did not start with COVID, but COVID definitely exacerbated these issues. So this all came to light a few years ago, and now we have more students than ever before who need to be evaluated for services, more students receiving services without the increase in funding or staffing to be able to support them. The burden has increased on evaluators and service providers, including general ed teachers. And as the workload becomes more and more untenable, people quit, which then increases the workload on those who stay. And it's getting to the point now where the system is collapsing. There's a mass exodus of people leaving. This will be my last year teaching in Texas for the same reason. So what this looks like in practice in classrooms with students who desperately need support, they need support that the gen ed teacher can't provide. Remember, the vast majority of students with disabilities are served in the general education classroom. But if you don't have the time or the support or the training or the help that you need to serve these students, you can't support them in the way that they need. I'm sure that y'all have had a student in your classroom who needs more support than you can give. And it's frustrating for everyone. It's not fair to the student. It fosters animosity between teachers and families. You or I may have their child's best interest at heart, but the system unequivocally does not. What we're seeing right now is the consequences of a society that has undermined public education. Public education is the best and only chance that we have to preserve our ideals as a nation. And I just want everyone here, I want you to take a second, and this is a little depressing, it's okay. I want you to take a second and I just want you to think about everything that we've gone through this past 18 months and everything that our students have gone through. So we have COVID, schools shut down, we have a seemingly never-ending parade of police brutality, we have more COVID, we have an attempted overthrow of our democracy, we have a solution to COVID that now millions of people are too selfish or misguided to utilize, and add in the rapidly increasing destruction of our planet, right? So we think about that, and then this is what we've gone through only in the past year and a half, right? This collective trauma. And now I want everyone here to just think of your classroom for a moment. You get to provide a place for children to come and feel heard and feel valued and feel safe. I really hate the martyrization, I'll call it, of teachers and support staff. I think it's a way to avoid paying us more because we do it because we're heroes instead of trained professionals. But what an amazing gift, right? It's an incredible privilege to be able to do this, but it's also a huge responsibility. And sometimes that's the only thing, the only positive thing I have to hold on to right now. This is what we get to give. This is what we have to give. And that's what I want you to take with you into this next school year. Thanks.
Well, Alyssa, I mean, and that was just a snippet of some of the stuff that she shared with us. Alyssa, thank you so much. It hurts me to think that teachers like yourself are being driven out, especially out of Texas, where it seems that more than ever, they need advocates such as yourself, right? They need educators, but you're right. This martyrization is just too much. It's too much of a burden to carry. And you know, one of the things that we have to grapple with is it's not just an influx of money that we need, right? We also need to make sure that we have the staff to do it and the working conditions to make it possible, right? We say this all the time in labor, especially teachers, teacher labor unions, where the students' learning conditions, right, are teaching conditions, right, and they affect each other, right? The better our teaching conditions are, the better a student's learning conditions are, and this can't be any more visible than it is in the fight for the funding of IDEA, right, for the Fulfill the Promise. So now I'm going to, and so thank you all, Tiffany, Anna, Martha, Alyssa, please feel free to just add on to this next part, but I'm gonna open it up to Debbie and to Georgia and Lisa, Evie, and Grace. They didn't know this was gonna happen, so please bear with us. But I just wanted to ask a couple more questions, and the way you would just feel free to jump in. Those of you not on camera, just turn on your camera. And of course, any of our esteemed guests can do so as well. So it sounds like there is quite a lot of solutions that are needed, right? That need to happen on the local, on the state, and the federal level. So with all of these different pressures, what should we prioritize now? What would have the most impact for our students? Who would like to take an initial stab at that? Okay, I see Tiffany, and then I'll go to one of our educators as well. I like this parent and educator. So go ahead, Tiffany.
I think what's really important is that we remember that we received funding, right, through emergency funds for COVID, and that funding is short term, and that we want something that's going to last over time. So we need to be able to hire and that's going to be able to last through the years, so that students are not consistently waiting to be assessed and waiting to get providers at their site school, because one school could have all the resources necessary, but because the provider is not there at their site, the child is left behind. So I think the most important thing is that we get funding that lasts, and that's not a quick fix.
Thank you, Tiffany. Georgia, I see your hand up.
Yeah, so we need a mind shift. We need to see our students as students first. Too often it's special ed students. And so looking at things that way gives folks an out to treat our students as less, as different, as, you know, as not being as important on our campuses as others. And so I think we need to start thinking differently and help our colleagues to think differently. My student is a student who receives special education services, but first and foremost, this is a student on our campus, and we need to make sure that that student receives what that student needs. And I think for some folks, that is going to take a little bit of work.
Thank you for calling that out, Georgia. Alyssa and Anna, I see your hands up, but I'm going to actually give you two a separate question, if you don't mind. First of all, the challenge to give special needs students and the support they deserve is daunting. I think all of us feel that here, but also my phone is blowing up. So this message is resonating with quite a few people. Anna and Alyssa, how do you keep up hope?
I would say that honestly, it's just because for me as a parent, I want my kid to have the best education possible. If I want my kid to still have that. So if I stop fighting, nobody else is fighting for him. Nobody else is fighting for my daughter. Nobody else is fighting for my son. I'm the only person who's out there fighting for them. And I do have people who support me like on our team, but one of the things that I was really thinking about was like my child had the best access to regular education this year that he's ever had. He's not allowed to go to certain places in his building because of his wheelchair or the time he needs out. And he didn't have access until this year. And I was the person who came back and said, hey, I really want him to have this. We can never not have this again. Nobody else stood up for that. Nobody else was helping him make sure he got into regular ed classes. Even his special education team who loves him and cares about him, they weren't able to do that. And for me, so I keep hope because I'm just like, he needs that. He needs to have that experience. He deserves that. Like he is a human being. I know we said that too, like general ed, special ed, they're all people. They're all people who are growing. And that's just, I mean, like I said, he deserves the world. Like I'm a parent, right? That's what we all think for our kids. They deserve the world. And I want my kid to have that. I want my kid to be able to go to history or to take whatever classes he wants and not have somebody say, well, you have a disability, you can't talk. Sorry, you're not going. I haven't been like that his entire life. I'm not about to stop.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Anna. Alyssa, how do you keep up hope?
I had to think about it for a little bit, so I'm glad Anna went first. I think ultimately the reason I got into this job and the reason I've stayed in this job is because it's something that I feel is worthwhile. Like I said, I believe with all my heart that public education is just the most important need we have in this country and the most important hope that we have for this country. And I want to make a difference. And it can be really hard when you're in a system that, pushes down it's on teachers, on families, on students, instead of pushing back. But I also know that if I became the teacher who is bitter and jaded, then it would be time for me to find a different job. So there are many things that are worth the fight. I think this one in particular is one that I'm well suited to fight, just because I have the knowledge and the expertise, and I can give more of myself to this cause in a way that I can't to a lot of other different causes. So I guess I keep hope because I don't have any other option, but I will say that having this organization and having this community, it does so much more for my sense of hope than anything else, because it can feel isolating when you feel like you're the only one who's sort of pushing back. And so to be surrounded with y'all is an awesome, hope-inducing feeling, I'll say.
Thank you, Alyssa. And thank you for all of our panelists. I thank you and appreciate your words. Just as a reminder, tomorrow we will hear from Dr. Khalid Gibran Mohammed in the webinar and then break out into our area meetings. But before we go, let's hear from some of our affiliate leaders and supporters, followed by a somber note, our annual In Memoriam video, where we honor those we have lost this year. Thank you so much.